Hello Year 11, welcome to the first Inspector Calls revision session. Today we're going to be looking at plot plus sequencing, which is essentially, if you can't do that, you can't do anything. So what we're going to go over is what happens when it happens, and we're basically going to look at 8 key moments from the play. And basically, if you can, in the exam, know really clearly what happens first, second, third, and yada yada yada, then you can do really, really well. People get very stressed about learning all the quotes and doing all the things, but actually the most important thing is knowing what happens and when it happens. So first we're going to look at the opening of the play, and we're going to think very carefully about where people sit. As the curtain rises, we see a normal, fairly wealthy family home, and importantly, we see a dining room table. The light's a bit annoying, I might try and change that. And around that table are all the characters. At two ends of the table, we have Mrs. B and Mr. B. And that's significant because we've got a patriarchal, standard 2.4 children nuclear family, and something that the audience in 1945 would be expecting to see, and something that would be normal for the time in 1912. So the head of the family is at one end and his wife is at the other. Alongside that, we have two characters. We are the audience. Can you see that? We are the audience here. Okay, so we're looking this way. So we have Gerald and Sheila here. Okay, we know that this is their engagement, so obviously Priestley puts those guys together, so we know that. And then finally, we have the bad boy, the black sheep of the family, Eric Birling, sitting here, which is important because it means that we in the audience cannot see him. Okay, now Priestley does another couple of things as well, which instantly set the tone of the piece. Number one, he has some things on the table. So he has some champagne flutes. That's a champagne flute. And now I'm going to draw this. He has some cigars. That's a cigar. Very clearly a cigar. Even with the light like that, it's very clearly a cigar. There's smoke coming off it. And that lets us know that it's a celebration and that this is a wealthy family. You know, in 1912, the class system isn't like it is today. You basically had the upper class and the working class, and a small but emerging middle class, which doesn't really develop until after the war. So we know this is an upper class family. They're rich. They're dressed in evening wear. The gentlemen are wearing tops and tails, and the ladies are in fancy dresses. So it's really important that the play opens like this, and Priestley doesn't do it by accident. Our next important event is the arrival of the inspector. So midway through the dinner party that is being held to celebrate Sheila and Gerald's engagement, the inspector arrives. And again, Priestley does something very purposeful with the inspector's arrival. Birling is giving a speech, and he's giving a speech about how every man has to look after himself. I'm going to have to draw something here. And he talks about community, and he says, some people, some cranks say that we are all bees. This is very clearly a bee. It's got a sting and an eye. We're all bees in a hive. And just as he's about to finish this speech, the inspector arrives and interrupts him. And it's an important moment because basically what Priestley is saying to us is that Birling is a man that we should not listen to and should not trust. He's already given his other speech, which is about how the Titanic, this is the Titanic, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then Jack and Rose on the front. I'm flying, Jack, I'm flying. And yeah, so he's already given this speech about how the Titanic is unsinkable and we don't trust him. And then the inspector arrives, and on top of the dramatic entrance being to interrupt Birling and not let him finish his point, because Priestley, the author, believes the exact opposite. He doesn't believe that community is nonsense. He thinks it's really important. But the lighting changes. So we've got this nice, warm, intimate lighting. Here we go. The lighting changes like this. A bit less techno-y maybe. But the lighting at the start is nice and warm and intimate and sort of relaxed and soft. And then as soon as the inspector arrives, it becomes quite harsh. So the lights literally turn on and illuminate what's happening. Moving on to our next important event, which is the interrogation of Mr. Birling. So the inspector works through all of the family one by one, asking them about their role in Eva Smith's death. Now remember, Eva Smith has committed suicide. She's drank some strong disinfectant. It says XXX because that's what, for some reason, bowls say on them. That's the worst drawing I've ever done. I've done some bad drawings. She's drank some strong disinfectant and it's burnt her insides out. And we need to find out how this has happened. And the first person he speaks to is Mr. Birling. And Mr. Birling first says he doesn't know Eva Smith, but then the inspector shows him a photo of Eva Smith with lots of nice hair, but she's looking very unhappy. And at that point he does remember, and he remembers that she was someone who worked in one of his factories. This is a factory, that's a chimney now. There's loads of windows because it's a massive factory because loads of people work there. So she was someone who worked in this factory here, and all of the workers in the factory went on strike to protest for higher wages. But because they were so poor, because they didn't have much money, they couldn't strike for very long. If you go on strike, then you don't get paid. You don't go to work, but you don't get paid for it either. So they couldn't strike for very long. So they all came back after 2 weeks. And at that point, he fired her for being a ringleader. The reactions of other characters are important here as well, because Eric is shocked by this. He says it's hard luck. And Gerald, who's engaged to Sheila, remember, says that actually he couldn't have done anything else and that he's done nothing wrong. The next person the inspector moves on to look at is Sheila. So we see the interrogation of Sheila. And we found out that after Eva Smith left her job at Birling's factory, she went to work in a clothes shop called Millward's that Sheila goes to. And one time Sheila went to this clothes shop and she tried on this very fetching dress. But she looked like a moron in it. You can see she looked really stupid. It's way too big for her. So she looked silly in it, and her mum had already said she thinks she looked silly in it. And then Eva Smith, who was working there, tried it on and it suited her. And worse than this, Sheila thought she saw Eva laughing at her. So she was in a temper. She said she was furious, and she went to the manager and she said that if this girl wasn't sacked immediately, then not only her but her mum and her father and everybody else in the family would stop shopping at Millward's. And this introduces a really important theme for us, which obviously you can tell from the quality of these drawings, which is power. This is a battery power. And it's really important that we get power as a theme here. And in case we're not sure, the inspector actually highlights it for us. He says, you use the power that you had as the daughter of a wealthy and important customer. So he really highlights this idea of power, and more importantly, the abuse of power. Number 4. Our fourth important event is the interrogation of Gerald. Okay, so Gerald, the only member of the cast present other than the inspector and Edna, I suppose, who is not a Birling, and we find out what he did to Eva Smith. And importantly, he claims not to have known her, but at the end of Act 1, the inspector mentions the name Daisy Renton, and he immediately gets himself a large glass of whiskey on the rocks. These are bits of ice. So he gets himself a large glass of whiskey because he obviously knows the name. And at the end of Act 1, just as the curtain falls, I feel like I've got to keep drawing things. Here's a curtain for you. Just as the curtain falls and we go off to get our ice creams, Gerald and Sheila are on stage and they're having this big argument about whether he does or doesn't know. So when the curtain rises, whoop, when the curtain rises, we see them and they're in the exact same moment. And he tries to get rid of Gerald. Gerald tries to get rid of Sheila. He's like, you don't need to hear this. May Mrs. Birling be excused, he says to the inspector. But she won't leave, and we find out that Gerald has had an affair, surprise, surprise, with Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, which is what she was calling herself. And he finds her in a bar in a place called the Palace Variety Theatre, which is somewhere between, I mean, in the modern day, it would sort of be not a million miles away from a strip club. Maybe not as bad as that, but it's certainly a place where women of the town, aka prostitutes, are known to hang out. So he finds her, and she is being sleazed on by Alderman Meggerty. And he describes the grotesque fat carcass of Alderman Megati, and he comes over and he sees Daisy Renton being sleazed on by this guy, and he rescues her and he takes her away and they have a meal together, and he doesn't want to have an affair with her at the start, or at least that's what he claims. He lends her some rooms that one of his friends got, and he lets her stay there, and she stays there for 6 months, and over that 6 months they do have an affair, and then eventually he feels like it's coming to an end and he boots her out, essentially. Importantly though, once he's revealed all this information, he says he'd like to go for a walk, and just before he leaves, Sheila says, "Oh no, Gerald, you better take this," and she gives him back the very expensive, as you can see, diamond, I don't know, it's not necessarily a diamond, could be anything, engagement ring, and she says, "Take this with you," symbolising that she thinks their relationship is over. Now at this point in the play, most of the characters have got a good idea of how the inspector works. So they know that he knows much more than he's letting on. The person who's the exception to this is Mrs. Birling, who's been out of the room this whole time and then comes bustling in for her interrogation and sort of goes head to head with the inspector, despite the fact that Sheila and Gerald suggest it's not a good idea. And we find out that Eva, here's Eva again, still very unhappy, possibly because her head's so big, has gone to see Mrs. Birling. And Mrs. Birling runs a charity, and the reason she's gone is because she's tres preg. There's a baby inside. Sorry about your forehead, Eva. And she asks for help because she is single, she's about to have a baby, she doesn't have a job and she can't work. But Mrs. Birling says, "No, sorry, Eva Smith, I will not help you." And the reason she refuses it is because Eva starts by lying. So Mrs. Birling thinks she was quite justified, those are her exact words, quite justified in her actions, because Eva Smith told some lies. She said, when she first arrived, she says her name is Mrs. Birling. And it turns out, obviously, that's not true. And Mrs. Birling also takes some offence to this because she's like, how can this scummy working class person use the same name as me? And she basically goes on the defence of Mrs. Birling and says that the person whose responsibility it is the father of the child. And we all know at this point that the father of the child is Eric, and the other characters have guessed as well. Sheila in particular gets it straight away. And this is the end of Act 2. So again, our magical curtain falls just as Mrs. Birling comes to the realisation that Eric is the father of the child. And they're all shell-shocked on stage. And we're waiting for Eric to come in, and we go off, and maybe we have a second ice cream, maybe we don't. I don't know, it depends how hungry we are. Event number 6 in our tie line is the interrogation of Eric. So the curtain rises for the start of Act 3. We already know that Eric is responsible. I'm going to draw a picture of Eric for you. We already know, I think he probably has a Mohican. He doesn't have a Mohican. Don't say he has a Mohican. He's probably a bit less happy than that. We already know that he is responsible for Eva Smith becoming pregnant. So this is no surprise to us. But what we find out straight away is, number one, the first time they had sex, he was very drunk. In fact, he can't even remember it. But he does tell us, number two, that she changed her mind. She didn't want to sleep with him. And he was in the sort of state where a chap easily turns nasty, is how he describes it. He was in the sort of state where a chap easily turns nasty. And so essentially what is being very strongly implied by Priestley here is that he raped her. They go on seeing each other for a while. She's probably working as a prostitute at this point, although Eric is too immature to understand this. He again picks her up in the Palace Variety Theatre. It sounds like she's got a madam, which is like a female pimp, that she has to go and see. And he keeps seeing her, and eventually she tells him she's pregnant. And at this point, Eric starts giving her big bags of dollary dues. Here's a swag bag that Eric's giving to her. You know it's a swag bag because there's cash on it. So he keeps giving her this money, and we find out that he's been stealing this money. Looks like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle now. He's not, he's a robber. We find out he's been stealing this money from his dad's office, and his dad goes nuts about this. And basically his dad is angrier than about him stealing the money than he is about what he's done to Eva. And it all starts kicking off when Eric finds out that Mrs. Birling, his mum, refused her charity just 2 weeks ago, and he blames her for the death of his child and her grandchild, and he's about to hit her when the inspector interrupts. Which leads us nicely into our 7th important event, which is the inspector leaves. Now, just as the family are having this argument about Eric's child and the Birling's grandchild, the inspector interrupts and he gives this big speech, and he says that man needs to learn to look after each other, and if they don't learn to do that, then they will learn to do it in fire. This is a fire, smoke, and blood and anguish. And he's obviously referencing the world wars here, which the audience would know because they've lived through both of them. The characters obviously don't, and Mr. Birling actually says there isn't going to be a war all the way back in Act 1, remember. But importantly, when the inspector leaves, the characters are on different sides of the stage. So Gerald isn't in the room. He's gone for his walk, remember. But Eric, with his Mohican, and Sheila, poor Sheila with a terrible haircut, are on one side of the room. And then Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling are on the other. And that's important. I think she has a bob. She's going to have a bob. This is a bob. And that's important because what Priestley is doing is he's setting them up as being at opposite ends of the spectrum, these two groups of people, and he's saying they have different beliefs. And instantly Mr. Birling points the finger of blame. Can I draw a finger? It's going to look very phallic. Oh well, that's very clearly a finger. I'm going to label it finger in case any of your parents are walking past. That's very clearly a finger. And I'm now going to rub it off. But he points the finger of blame straight at Eric, and he says, Eric, this is all your fault. In fact, his exact words are, you're the one I blame for this. That's the first thing that's said after the inspectors left. And it tells us that Birling and Mrs. Birling don't take responsibility. Eric replies by saying, I'll bet I am. And it's very clear in this section of the play that Eric and Sheila take responsibility. Now, after they've had an argument for a bit, Gerald returns and they have a conversation and they work out that the inspector wasn't a real police inspector. So after Gerald comes back, that becomes clear, and Mr. Birling decides he's going to do something about it. Which leads us on to our final point of our 8-point plot summary, which is, was it real? So after they've worked out that it isn't a real inspector, Birling picks up the phone and he rings and he finds out that there's no man called Ghoul or no one who fits the description of the inspector working on the force. And they're all celebrating. Gerald tries to give Sheila the ring back, but at the very end, we get, I should be able to draw a phone. They don't use iPhones. We get a telephone call. Dun, dun, dun. And Mr. Birling picks it up and he finds out that a girl has died through committing suicide as a result of drinking strong disinfectant, and that a police officer is on the way round. And we're left thinking, or questioning, I should suppose, whether this is because the Birlings have refused to accept responsibility for their actions and they've refused to learn the lessons that the inspector has tried to teach them. So I hope that was useful, Year 11. And one really useful thing for you to do now would just be to write down those 8 events, and next to each one, see if you can remember 2 quotes. I've chucked a few at you as we've gone through this video, but just write down those 8 events. Your quotes have to be better than little scribbles, but just see if you can write down some key quotes for each one. The best quotes are short quotes. Often not more than a few words, sometimes just one word, but just see what you can remember. You will surprise yourself. Treat yourself to a biscuit at the end if you get, I don't know, let's say more than 12 quotes. If you get the full 16, maybe you could have a biscuit and a cheeky kind of Vimto.